So welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for coming out of the rain. I really appreciate that. Before we begin, I want to thank some of the people who were integrally involved with helping us put on the Third LA project. Marty Sharkey, Rebecca Stoltz, Laura Crescenza, and Mark Campos, who is here also. I also wanted to let you know that there will be a reception afterwards with beer and wine and hors d'oeuvres at Bronca Patio. And if you don't know the campus, it's basically straight back out of this building and right across the quad. And if you follow the crowd, I'm sure you'll find us there. I'm really excited to begin the Third LA series. We inaugurated this series last year, and we were really pleased and thrilled and impressed by the response. Virtually every event was sold out, and it included journalists and architects and policymakers and politicians, and it was a remarkable testimony to Christopher's acumen in bringing interesting people together and as well as introducing our students to this kind of discussion and including them in it. A few years ago, when we tried to sit back and think what set Occidental apart, we realized that it was our location. Outside our doorstep, the world's problems and opportunities are being played out on a daily basis. And it's a responsibility and a privilege to educate our students about the possibilities of democratic life, the challenges facing a great metropolitan area like Southern California, and to really integrate the city into the curriculum and make sure that our students are shuttling back and forth. And so that's really been an animating part of what we've been working on for the last several years. And Christopher's Third LA is a testament to that, and it's really the public face of that commitment. Tonight's tonight we'll devote ourselves to the subject of lawns. Lawns are not just about the drought. They're actually far more perplexing than they might seem. They're a source of pride, pastoralism, keeping up with the Joneses, keeping off the lawn, conventionality, recreation, conspicuous waste. They invoke a vast and unseen infrastructure of dams and aqueducts. And they are also a metaphor for one of the great poems of the United States, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, a poem devoted to democracy. So lawns are much more complicated entities than they might seem. And who better to introduce us to that subject than Christopher Hawthorne. He has been wrestling with policy issues around urban infrastructure and architecture for the last 2 decades. And for the last 12 years, he's served as the architecture critic for the Los Angeles Times, and he's a professor here teaching classes in the art history department and the urban environmental policy department. He grew up in Berkeley, graduated from Yale, and before joining the Times, he was the architecture critic for Slate and a regular contributor to the New York Times. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great, great pleasure to introduce Christopher Hawthorne and to thank him for his remarkable stewardship of this series.
Thank you, President Veach, for that really, really kind introduction. I'm really thrilled to be back to welcome all of you to kick off another season of Third LA. And before anything else, I really want to echo President Veach's thanks to everyone who's made this series possible here at Occidental, and also to you for your great support of this whole project. I think the series is really a natural and complementary extension in many ways of Oxy's commitment to a really sustained engagement with the city and region around the campus. And I want to say hello to everybody who's watching us via live stream, probably a few who stayed home because of the rain, and I think a significant number outside of Los Angeles and Southern California. As President Veach mentioned, we were really thrilled with the response to the events last year on topics including the future of the LA River, immigration and architecture, the 25th anniversary of the hugely influential, if supremely bleak, Mike Davis book, City of Courts, And we're really pleased once again at how much interest the series seems to have generated around the city. Before we get to the topic at hand this evening, the lawn and the complications of the lawn, as President Veach mentioned, let me give you a brief overview of what we have in store for the rest of the semester, and then talk a little bit about the concept of the Third Los Angeles, what we mean by that idea, how it shapes these conversations. It's important, first of all, to say that these events are closely connected with and really grow out of a course at UEP, which is held at this very time, Wednesday evenings. The students are in the middle of a kind of experiment. The class is very much, as I explained to them in the first meeting, a hybrid. The weeks that we're in class, it's very much like a traditional seminar where we're really digging into reading about the history of Los Angeles. And then on nights when we have a public event, the class is connected to these discussions with the kinds of guests that we've brought together this evening. We will be opening up registration for the next couple of events beginning tomorrow. We will be next month on March 16th at the Hammer Museum, where I'm pleased to say we have a co-presentation with the Hammer. I will be in conversation with Jeanette Sadiq Khan, who was the director of transportation for Mayor Bloomberg in New York, and is the one who was really the steward of a lot of very bold and somewhat controversial efforts to open up new space for pedestrians in New York City, also an Oxy alumna. So she and I will be talking about her new book about those efforts in New York City. We will be back here at Oxy at the end of March, on March 30th, to talk about the Olympics, not just the 2024 bid, but also it's one of those topics that really fits quite neatly into the Third LA framework. Talk about the Olympics of 1932, which tends not to get mentioned too often, and the Olympics of 1984, of course, before turning to the strengths and weaknesses of the bid for 2024. And there will be other events throughout the rest of the semester that you can find on the Third LA website, finishing up with a collaboration with SPUR, the San Francisco nonprofit, for a conversation, both one to be held in San Francisco and one to be held down here on campus, on the relationship between technology and the city. And finally, I'll mention that this year, as a result of feedback that I got from my students in the course last year, we are having the students themselves choose one topic, and that will be here on April 6th. And pleased to say that they've chosen homelessness as the topic, a very timely subject. The title of that event is Homelessness and the Right to the City. And they as a group will be picking panelists and inviting them and really structuring the entire event. So that's a bit of a change from last year, and I think should be a really productive one. A quick question, by show of hands, how many of you came to at least one of the Third LA events last year? Okay, so a pretty good group. Welcome back, and for those of you who are new to the series and those of you who need a little refresher, let me give you a really quick primer on the concept, this conceptual framework of the Third Los Angeles, what we mean by the three LAs. The project, as I mentioned, is really a hybrid, a course here connected to these talks, and its basic goal is to hold up for scrutiny a city that is moving into a dramatically new, I would say, if uncertain phase in its civic development, as it finally builds a comprehensive transit system and pays serious attention to a long-neglected civic realm. Los Angeles is in the midst of, in quite a few ways, a profound reinvention, or maybe it's better to call it a profound identity crisis. But either way, I think it's fair to say the old cliches about the city no longer apply. This is not the deeply private place it was for much of the post-war period, in some ways that we'll discuss tonight in connection with the lawn. It's tentatively moving back in the direction of public space and the public realm. At the same time, it's important to remember that many of the things that LA is struggling to add, and in fact grew infamous for not having in the post-war period, namely mass transit and places to walk, civic architecture, innovative multifamily housing, the city produced in really enviable quantities in the early decades of the 20th century. And in the most basic sense, that's why we're calling this initiative the Third Los Angeles. We're not just entering a new phase, moving from A to B. We're also rediscovering, in many ways, the virtues and challenges of an earlier phase and acknowledging the full sweep of LA's modern history. So The shorthand is essentially, of course, Los Angeles is founded in 1781, but modern Los Angeles really isn't born until the 1880s. That's the decade of the first population boom, the first real estate boom and bust. It's the decade that the rest of the continent really gets here with the connection of the Transcontinental Railroad. It's the decade that the telephone it becomes an important technology here. And at the beginning of the 1880s, the population of Los Angeles is still quite small. It's a city of 10 or 11,000 people. It quadruples or quintuples in that decade, and really the kind of headlong growth that LA becomes famous for really begins in that decade. So the first LA for our purposes is the 1880s through World War II. Second Los Angeles is that post-war, rapidly expanding city that is really engaged in building suburbia and a kind of privatized city at a metropolitan scale. This radical experiment of Los Angeles and the second Los Angeles really trying to be a city with global reach and global economic power, really built around the building blocks of a private city, the private realm, the single-family house, the lawn for that matter, and the freeways that tie it all together. And now we're entering this new phase, the third Los Angeles, having run out of room to sprawl and virgin land to conquer. The city is really doubling back on itself in all sorts of ways. And I think even more than that, it's a city that, as we talked about in a range of ways last year, is really much more aware of its limits, limits in terms of resources, limits in terms of that sprawl than it ever was. And it's, I think, keenly aware of what it struggles to do along with what it hopes to do in ways that really distinguish this period from the post-war period. And in the simplest terms, the challenge of this third LA is to retrofit the second Los Angeles to make it more public, more human-scaled, more open, ideally more equitable as well. And that effort has some key lessons to learn from the architecture and urbanism of the first Los Angeles. In other ways, though, this is a new city. Demographically, it looks nothing like the first or second LA. It's really a city where a Latino plurality is becoming a Latino majority, and there are fresh challenges that mark this third LA as surely as these new opportunities do. Surely these include climate change, as we'll talk about tonight, the decline of manufacturing in many ways, and a system of governance that's really marked by weak leadership and a kind of feeble level of civic engagement. And I think the other thing that's changed is that the growth machine, this idea that LA could grow its way out of any problem, has really come to an end as well. So one of the ideas that the series of public talks last year really crystallized for me was that the framework of the three LAs, one of the things that it does most powerfully is to suggest that all those stereotypes, all those tropes, all those cliches about Los Angeles, most of them produced in the post-war second LA, are not actually permanent emblems of the city, despite what the New York Times would tell you, despite what kind of more stereotypical treatments of the city would say. Each of them, car culture, the freeway, the concrete LA River, each of them has a before and has an after, which brings us to the lawn, which we'll be discussing this evening. There's been a lot of talk in the last couple of years around policy, around ecology, around landscape architecture connected to lawns and their role in Southern California, thanks in large part to several years of drought and the longer-term implications of climate change. A lot of talk about taking out our lawns, what we might replace them with. The landscape architect Mia Lehrer visited our class last week and made the argument to the students that what's been lacking so far in this conversation is both some nuance and some historical perspective. And as President Veach mentioned, it's a more complicated subject than we sometimes acknowledge. And I have to say I agree with that notion. I agree with Mia Lehrer's notion. And we hope that the conversation this evening will provide some of both of those things, a little bit more nuance, a little bit more historical perspective. So I have just a couple of images to before I introduce our first speaker. This is a piece by David Hockney, 1967, A Lawn Being Sprinkled is the title, indicative of that second Los Angeles idea of the lawn as the kind of centerpiece of the private domestic sphere in Los Angeles, connected, of course, to water and the infrastructure of water and larger questions about water, but also to this idea of, instead of this being a city that has one central park, this is a city that built tens of thousands of miniature central parks and backyards all across the region. And keeping in mind what I said about the tropes of Los Angeles, having a before and having an after, I think one goal of the discussion tonight is to talk about what comes after the lawn. If we do have some kind of agreement that the lawn makes very little sense here in terms of water resources, what do we replace the lawn with? What comes after it? But I also want to think, as I said, about what comes before. What did the landscape of Los Angeles, the landscape of domestic Los Angeles, and public Los Angeles, for that matter, look like in the first LA, before the lawns became so ubiquitous? And that connects to a question of what our public sphere looks like. And to go with that Hockney as a kind of complement is this image by Ed Ruscha from his book 34 Parking Lots, also from that same year, 1967, suggesting, although there is a lawn, of course, at the center of this image, really what you're meant to see is not the lawn, but the parking and the concrete around it. That kind of asphalt lawn, which is itself beautifully landscaped. This image, this perspective, gives you a sense of the kind of geometry of that parking lot. But nonetheless, it's the lawn that is being squeezed out by the massive construction of this infrastructure of the car, which is, of course, connected to the freeway that's happening around the same time. So I think now we need to be having a conversation about whether a lawn makes sense in a domestic landscape, but we also have to have, I think, a more sophisticated conversation about what we do in our public spaces. How much water do we give to those few spaces where the public really does gather and which really do feel like democratic spaces, like the lawn by the Hollyhock House. And there's several other examples of that. The few places where people do come together and the lawn does operate in that kind of democratic way. How do we make decisions about how much water we spend on those? And then those of you who saw my piece in the LA Times today about this house by John Lautner, which has just been donated as part of a bequest to LACMA, this is not really a point about the lawn so much as the landscape of this house, which is very much a tropical landscape. Jim Goldstein, who owns this house and is pledged it to LACMA, told me when I was talking to him for that story that he had a very productive relationship with John Lautner over the years as they remade this house. The one thing they disagreed about, he told me, was the landscape. And they are both from the Midwest. Jim Goldstein is from Wisconsin. John Lautner grew up in Michigan. And Goldstein told me he wanted the luscious, most tropical landscape he could afford. John Lautner wanted a much sparer landscape with a few pine trees and not much else. So it raises the question, now that this is a piece of architecture that the museum will control and it will have a much more public role, what's the future of this landscape? Do we see it as wasteful, profligate? Do we see it as connected to the architecture and the vision of the house? Is the landscape and the water that supports it something that we want to preserve along with the architecture of this house? And those are the questions I think that the city is beginning to face, and beginning to really grapple with now as we move into this third Los Angeles. So let me give you a very quick overview of the format this evening. One of the things we did in all of the panels last year was really to try to be creative about format, not just have people join a panel and talk for an hour or so and say things that many of you have heard them say before. But we really wanted to try to have a variety of perspectives. We wanted to have some short presentations and some longer ones, some individual presentations and some panel discussions. And that's something we certainly want to carry over into the events this year as well. So this is what we'll do in the time that remains. First, we will look back to that first Los Angeles with a presentation from Jennifer Watts from the Huntington, whom I will introduce in a moment. That will be followed by a kind of video essay, which I commissioned from a writer named Colin Marshall, who some of you may know. He writes for The Guardian and a number of other publications. He now splits his time between Los Angeles and Seoul, and he actually produced this video essay from South Korea. And it is about the lawn as represented in movies about and in Los Angeles. And so we'll see a kind of commentary from him about what role the lawn plays in Hollywood's representations, I think with a nod to Tom Anderson's great film, Los Angeles Plays Itself, which I recommend if you haven't seen it. And then Elizabeth Diller, the architect who's joined us, will show a few images from a great exhibition that was at the CCA in Montreal way back in, it was actually 1998, I didn't realize it was that long ago. And a few images actually of the plaza right next to the Broad Museum, which her firm designed and which opened last fall. Talk about the little patch of lawn that's there and some other ideas that her office had for that piece of kind of constructed landscape in the middle of, on the top of Bunker Hill in the middle of downtown LA. And then Liz and landscape architect Jim Burnett and Professor Gretchen North from here at Oxy, we will convene for a conversation to close the event about the lawn and how we weigh these different questions about what the future of the lawn is in Los Angeles. So let me introduce Jenny Watts. She's curator of photography at the Huntington Library, author of the recent book, A Strange and Fearful Interest, Death, Mourning, and Memory in the American Civil War, and editor of the Yale University Press publication about the great architectural photographer Maynard L. Parker, subtitled Modern Photography and the American Dream. And Jenny's going to show us some photographs of those early landscapes from First LA. Jenny.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here this evening. Thank you, Christopher, for the invitation to be here, because the idea of the landscape of Los Angeles is something I've been thinking about for about 20 years, and that really grows right out of the collections that I oversee. The Huntington has a collection of about 1 million photographs, and a large portion of those are dedicated to the topography of Los Angeles from the very beginning. So I want to start from the very beginning with an image that continues to astonish me. And again, I'm going to just give a little brief context here. But this is really the San Gabriel Valley, 1877, on the cusp of the boom. And just to orient you, for those of you who are from Pasadena, this is looking north to the San Gabriel Mountains. This is Marengo Avenue, and this is Fair Oaks Avenue, looking to Old Town Pasadena. Okay, 1877 by the great photographer Carlton Watkins. And what you notice here is we're beginning to have an agricultural landscape, but it's very pristine in terms of kind of the topography. You have the oak savanna here, you have the grasses. The early settlers talked about the greasewood, the sagebrush, the kind of barren nature of it. And early settlers talked about seeing their neighbors coming from miles away, which is kind of a mind-bending concept in this day and age. But 1877, 1885, you get the boom, and you start having the arrival of Midwesterners. And they were slow to embrace this idea of the lawn, even though one assumes that they come immediately and start putting in lawns. And I love this image because here they're putting in a formal hedge, and they've dragged out the chaise lounge to lull for the photographer who must be on the roof of the new house. But the lawn as we think of it is not in evidence here. Another image by Carlton Watkins, again, 1877, a very early settler, and we've got the New England house. This person was from Boston, but what we see is we begin to see the incredible just fascination with this kind of semi-tropical, as they called it, this exotic vegetation, the flowering agave here, the yuccas, the geraniums, the sago palms, the grasses. Again, very, very typical of the era, the pampas grass, the yucca, of course there's citrus in the background here, but a lot of dirt, no real grass per se. Now this isn't because there wasn't water, there was quite a lot of water through artesian wells and other sources from the San Gabriel Valley. But there's, again, just this amazed notion that you can plant anything and it will grow instantaneously. Here's an image that says the lawn view. And you can see he's watering it. But again, it's ground cover, palms, maybe this is canna, you've got geraniums. And this is a concept that really takes hold. By 1895, you've got this article in the Land of Sunshine, which was a booster publication called Gardens of Eden While You Wait. And you see a progression here. This idea, you can plant it in June 1893. 1893, and by October 1894, you've got a fully, a fully vegetated house. And he said, but they say here, right here, is where the lawn was seeded in October. In February '94, it was already a velvety and perfect a lawn as can be found. So by this point, as we're getting into the into the 20th century, this lawn notion has become imported, is very much integrated into the landscape, and you have kind of a hybridization of the lawn with the incredible, overwhelming flowering plants. And here you see the hose in the foreground. The plaza, the LA Plaza, with the city waterworks in the background here. And this is an unusual view in that you actually see a worker watering. Usually in these kinds of images, there's no labor to be seen whatsoever. So by the point you come to, at the turn into the 20th century, this, my friends, is a typical California residence. And usually it says typical California residence in winter. But this is the popular image that gets put out across the land, the gleaming lawn, the citrus, the flowering plants, etc. But let's not kid ourselves. In 1908, you have still shooting on the San Fernando Desert. And this is why we need to bring water from the Owens Valley and the Colorado River, so that by 1946, 1954, you have your little lawn in Lakewood, your man of the house mowing in his green shoes. That's always interesting. But let's not forget, if it's kind of back to the future here, if we were to colorize this image and make it look more modern, this is very much a turf abatement kind of landscape where you've ripped out the lawn and you're planting the same kind of plants that we're seeing all over the city right now. So with that, I will turn it over to the next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And now we're going to see this short video essay from Seoul, from Colin Marshall about the lawn.
For much of the 20th century, it seemed as if Los Angeles had invented a new form of modern city, the city of houses.
Thank you.
Right.
And so, given Los Angeles' centrality to the film industry at the time, the house became as important a unit of place in the movies as it was in the city itself. As small-scale, nth-generation imitations of rural estates, these houses tended not to look complete unless surrounded, or at least fronted, by a lawn.
Will you come in, please?
What?
I'd like you to come in till I get the lights on.
What for?
Because I don't feel safe till I get the lights on.
The movies knew the meaning inherent in the act of crossing that public-looking but very private band of green, whether it belonged to a frame-fillingly aspirational mansion, a modest bungalow, or one of the tract homes epically replicated in the post-war years. The cinema of Los Angeles has told stories amid lawns at every economic stratum, high or low.
Let's go to the club. Okay.
This led observers, even after the riots in the 60s, but less so after the riots in the 90s, to express surprise, especially strong among those who hadn't spent much time in Los Angeles, at the suburban, low-rise character of these landscapes of unrest. At least they don't live in those awful high-rises like in New York or Chicago or St. Louis, they thought. At least they have their own walls, their own roofs, their own lawns.
How you doing?
And even the movies set in those neighborhoods widely thought of as afflicted tell a surprising range of stories amid the seemingly dull materials of all those humble houses and their often neglected patches of grass. The predictable spectacles of drugs and drive-bys, yes, but also coming-of-age tales and rich pieces of neo-realism. Opinion has started to turn in the real Los Angeles against the once requisite lawn, in no small part because of the water it consumes. The boosters of the early 20th century used the city's natural landscape, with its uncanny ability to grow lush green lawns and much else besides, to sell massive amounts of real estate. But as the population grew, people began to think about where the water for all this plant life came from, a question whose mildly troubling answer Chinatown spun into a foundational myth of Los Angeles. It told a heightened but nonetheless compelling story that, as time went on, got more and more of us instinctively associating lawns, however pleasant we found them, with decadence, illegitimacy, and large-scale theft.
Would you like something to drink?
What are you having?
Iced tea.
That'll be fine, thank you.
2 iced teas.
Penis!
Penis!
You having fun?
We also, of course, associate the lawn with a certain idea of suburban domestic life, so strongly that it sometimes takes a movie to remind us that lawns also exist in the public sphere, or more often in Los Angeles, the quasi-public sphere. 500 Days of Summer captured a piece of the zeitgeist early in the 21st century downtown revival, setting its architect protagonist and his girlfriend down in Angels Knoll Park to overlook the city's classic built beauty. A vista that conveniently excludes all the glossy high-rises right behind them, and one that almost lets us forget how quickly Angels Knoll closed down to become a brown, trash-scattered shambles. Half a century earlier, Rebel Without a Cause famously showcased Griffith Observatory and the neat geometry of its lawn in a school field trip scene. But the lawns of institutions don't usually look this good. At least they didn't by the early 1980s, when patchy dying grass signaled a public school just as clearly as did the architecture and the yellow buses. After the end of the school day, students returned to their own residential streets to invite each other to cross their own lawns, whose condition often didn't look much better.
Well, this is me.
Have any iced tea?
Yeah, sure. Come on in.
That sort of thing happens every day. But when, say, a passing comet obliterates nearly all human life in Los Angeles, the deliberate hypernormality of the setting only intensifies the strangeness of the events. Paranoia, suspicion, angst, apocalypse, all feel that much more inescapable amid the psychologically empty spaces of the lawn.
It's Saturday morning. Where are the goddamn kids?
When the films of the 1980s and 90s started to question at what price well-off Angelenos had established for themselves an illusion of suburban safety, they dropped the so-called urban problems their complacent characters had assumed they'd escaped straight onto their doorsteps, or more threatening still, onto their lawns. But even Los Angeles lowlives have lawns of their own, which not only fail to protect them from, but in fact render them more vulnerable to the intrusions of their own kind. A city of houses turns out to be rather difficult to defend from itself, and the LAPD's famous helicopters, made famous to a great extent by the movies, can only accomplish so much from the air above all the horizontality. And as Los Angeles action movies have repeatedly demonstrated, just because you don't have a traditionally menacing urban environment at hand doesn't mean you can't have your shootout on the lawn.
Good shot, Billy. Let's go.
How will we come to regard the lawns of Los Angeles cinema, which we once took for granted as a normal part of the background, but will inevitably, like medieval castles or Old West saloons or mid-century automats, stand for a certain time and a certain place? They won't wholly disappear from our lives anytime soon, but as the previous Los Angeles becomes the next Los Angeles, the remaining patches of the much-filmed 20th century city of houses will increasingly become the stuff of period pieces. Their canvases artfully painted with the deep green of the grass and the bright reds and blues of the cars driving past it. It was a vivid dream while it lasted.
I'm trying to think of where there's a place to have a drink around here.
Isn't there one at the Taft Hotel? What is the matter?
Nothing. I'm just wondering if they have a bar or not. I mean, let's go see. Let's go see if they do or not.
So let's hear for Colin Marshall in absentia, all the way in Seoul. And I recommend his similar video essay on the Bonaventure Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, which you can find easily online, and the ways that it's been used and abused by Hollywood directors over the years. So now we'll hear from Liz Diller, co-founder of the New York architecture firm Diller Scofidio, now Diller Scofidio and Renfro, a firm whose projects, as most of you will know, include the Broad Museum in downtown LA and its adjacent patch of lawn, the new Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, with an even smaller patch of lawn at the back, the High Line, of course, with James Corner Field Operations with no lawn, and the in-progress Culture Shed in New York. And she was also, as I mentioned briefly before, importantly for our purposes this evening, principal in charge of the Canadian Centre for Architecture exhibition, The American Lawn, The Surface of Everyday Life, which I was lucky enough to see in Montreal all the way back in 1998. Which also included a really excellent catalog, which I recommend. And really, in many ways, I think started, along with essays by Michael Pollan and others, really started this conversation about what the lawn meant in contemporary, about to be 21st century United States, and to the degree to which the lawn was imported, even in the Northeast. Now we're sort of doubling, complicating that question. What does it mean to import that kind of pastoral landscape from the East Coast to Southern California? So Liz is going to show a small handful of slides taking us back to that show and to the Broad Museum before we move on to a discussion about the lawn with our other panelists. Liz.
That's good. Thanks, Christopher. I just thought I'd run that in the background. So about, I guess, 18 years ago, a bunch of Princeton faculty were sitting around, and besides myself, there was George Peso and Alessandra Ponte and Beatrice Colomina, Mark Wigley. These are historians and theorists, and we just cooked up this idea of, turn it down a little bit more. Is that good? Okay. And we cooked up this idea of doing a show on the American lawn. And I think we were all totally imposters. Some of these guys were European and they had no idea what the American lawn was. I myself never lived in a house. I never mowed a lawn. I had no idea. I'm still kind of an imposter here. I still have no idea. But we thought about this as a little bit of a cultural research. And these guys, because they're very artifact-oriented as curators for this possible exhibition, kind of dropped out of the picture because there was nothing physically to show. So we had to make everything up. My studio had to make everything up. So it was, for us, it was a meditation on the complex culture of the lawn, and started with the British antecedents and through the developing American suburbs, the geopolitics of the Freedom Lawn, and if I'm kind of like having that on, and it covered historic stuff and contemporary stuff, artistic and scientific stuff, high culture, low culture, and it demonstrated, or it tried to demonstrate that there's something, there's more to the simple carpet of grass than meets the eye. And so we looked for the various portrayals, and we made this video. And you had to walk across it, was the threshold for the entrance to the show. But we wanted to look at it as benign for a platform for controlled domestic growth, but also as a sinister surface of repressed horror. And one remembers like this fabulous scene of David Lynch in Blue Velvet. But the lawn is anything but natural. I think we can all agree. It's purely a sign of civilization. And this show covered a lot of territory. We divided the topic into the federal lawn and collective solidarity that we have around the lawn, like the National Mall and so forth. The institutional so the institutional part of that, and then the corporate lawn, the corporate campus, and a lot of the '60s, beautiful work of Saarinen and SOM and so forth. So the lawn used for power and control, and also the domestic lawn as a kind of battleground between the democratic image of uniformity and the right to self-expression guaranteed by the First Amendment. And this was one of the galleries where we had actually, so on the ground projected various court cases surrounding the lawn and freedom of expression. And as well, we sent a photographer around the country to photograph these kind of moments in between two neighbors and lawns. And these were stereoscopic, so you can look and see the three-dimensional effect of these conditions, and it kind of went on, and this was pretty interesting. And then we also looked at the lawn as an engineered product that's patented and subject to the laws of industry and genetic science. And this display, and it was really complicated to do this, but we had done a lot of research around lawn cultivars and all the engineering being done around lawns. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of species of lawns that are being developed, and cultivars that are made to be greener, to be softer, to be more resilient to drought, more resilient to wear and tear and so forth. And that was pretty fascinating. And we also looked at species of astroturf and what this astroturf intended, how close, the height of the pile and the backings and everything. And so we just got into all of these topics, none of our business, but we're fascinated by the blemishes on the lawn. I mean, these are dog pee and the various things that happen on lawns and subject of great scrutiny. And then we were also interested in sports, turf, and then we got very fascinated with the cleats of shoes that have to deal with the turf. And in this case, we had this display of cleats on shoes, and the display, the actual glass that you look through was held by the cleats of these shoes that was held upside down. So that was a bit of fun. This is what architects do with their free time. Anyway, and then we were very interested in these, long mowing patterns, and there was just so many. And there's a huge, just as there's a great competition of baseball teams, there's a great competition of lawn mowers of baseball stadiums. And we went on to looking at these infrared views of various cities around the U.S. and actually red represents green, represents lawn, and represents very problems that we're going to be talking about today with the absence of water and a kind of sustainability around the desire of the lawn. Christopher had asked me to also talk a little bit about the Broad and that patch of grass that's there. And I have to say that even though the lawn is maligned a lot today, I love lawns. I love touching them. I love running my hands through them. And actually that exhibition in the front lawn of the CCA we counted all the blades of grass, and we actually mowed the number into the lawn itself. But there's like this passion around the subject. But very, very quickly, when we built the Broad Museum, we built it on an elevated area on Grand Avenue and over GTK, just to the south. And we asked ourselves, in this spot that we were going to preserve as public space, why would anybody want to come here, and what was special about it? And we worked with Walter Hood also. And the kind of curious thing about building on top of artifice is, how do you do it? And after having done also the High Line, we're actually very familiar with the unnaturalness of growing stuff up in the air. And so we thought about it this way. And basically, we're on a concrete bridge. We turned the structure upside down and made planting beds in it. And the curiosity is, like, how do you plant trees? How do you do anything in this concrete structure, and perhaps spirit? This is just some other information about these nursing logs and cutting room floor around what we didn't do. This tensegrity structure with nurse logs, which are fallen logs that attract new growth, seedlings and so forth. But ultimately, we worked on this very, very much stimulated by Banham's fifth, the four ecologies, and thinking about a fifth ecology, and just looking at some of the work that artists have been doing with nature and kind of pushing nature to the limits. And we started to imagine a garden of trees that misbehave. And so this would be a normal tree, but a tree here could be very, very close to a normal tree, but not, without roots. Very much about Hollywood. It could feel your motion, feel your attraction, talk back to you. It could shake. It could actually be out of season all the time somehow. It could be greener than green, like Antonioni. And it could move. Actually, it could rotate to the sun, and it could project a shadow of something that isn't it, and it could. In this case, we actually cut a piece of the trunk out of it and replaced it with another material, in which, but still, the nourishment still penetrates. Half and half tree that's grafted together, which these kinds of things actually happen, and other kinds of trees. I won't go into that, artificial limb trees and so forth. And then we ultimately came to the idea that we would have this great arbor, and some of those trees would migrate across the street, literally across the street. They would move on wheels, and they would go back and forth according to the streetlights. Eli Bro didn't allow us to do any of this, so we ended up doing these 120-year-old olive trees that were very much sparked by the same kind of sense of unnaturalness of LA, and the newness of certain things and the oldness of it as well. There is a patch of lawn. It's about a quarter of the space that we have, and there's been a lot of questioning about why do a lawn now. And here, I guess we might talk about that in general. But for us, it's still a kind of privilege. It's still a moment, and it's an opportunity to cultivate in a very, very small and thoughtful way a piece of space that one could actually sit on that resist the heat island effect, that is a place for play. And that's all. Thank you.
Okay, so that's on. Hello. I'm going to invite Liz to join us, and Jim Burnett and Gretchen North, and I will introduce them as they come up. Let me grab my phone so I know what time it is. We got a little bit of a late start, so we'll We'll try to wrap up by 9 o'clock. Please join us. And let me introduce at my immediate left. You're good. Someone who will be familiar to many people in this room, Gretchen North, professor of biology here at Occidental, member of the advisory committee for Oxy's Urban Environmental Policy Institute. Her research focuses on plant physiological ecology with an emphasis on the water relations of arid land plants and plants in the rainforest canopy. And so I really wanted to have at least, I wanted to have her perspective on the ecological side of this conversation. If we can, and it's a real pleasure to have her joining us. At her left, Jim Burnett is a landscape architect who founded Office of James Burnett in 1989 in Houston, now has offices in San Diego and Boston as well, and has completed really significant work at Rice and Caltech, right? And most germane to our discussion at the former Annenberg estate called Sunnylands in Rancho Mirage, where his work has included some pretty significant turf removal, to use one of the current euphemisms for tearing out lawn. Sunnylands has also been in the news this week, of course, because President Obama has been meeting there with leaders of several Asian nations, and so I want to hear his perspective about working out there in the most arid of arid lands in Southern California. But Liz, I have to follow up on what you showed, which was terrific, and hasn't really appeared anywhere as far as I know, those alternate schemes that you and Walter proposed for Grand Avenue. So I have to ask, what was the reaction from Eli Broad? How close did you come to seeing any of those? How did that process work that led you to what you showed, the final product? Because I think that the artificiality of the lawn itself and that landscape, which is so artificial, the kind of double-decker nature of Grand Avenue at that site, could have made that a really. I think it's a pity that you weren't able to carry some of those out.
No, it was really very sad for us. You know, I don't think that it caught Eli's imagination and nor anybody else's there. You know, for us, it was the natural thing to do. Is we were on GTK Way and 30 feet above the traffic, and it just to be able to connect to the ground, to the real ground, and the alternative ground, made a real difference. Just the understanding, just the perception that you are elevated, and that, you know, in the miracle of miracles, that we can grow things up in the air. So, you know, in the end, it was not the main focus. There was a huge focus on programming that area, and the lawn really came out of the desire to have seminars there, to have school groups there, to show films in the evening and so forth. So what was dominant at that point was programming and not the arbor. So for another project.
Yes, and Jim, can you tell us a little bit about the work you've been doing at Sunnylands, and maybe take us back a little bit to talk about that house by A. Quincy Jones, which is a significant piece of Southern California modernism, but also the landscape that surrounded it, and the Annenbergs' desire to have a kind of almost Pennsylvania-like rolling landscape that they could see from the windows of that house in the middle of Rancho Mirage in the desert.
Right. Thank you, Christopher. The Annenberg estate was built in the 60s, and as Christopher said, it was A. Quincy Jones' kind of masterpiece that the Annenbergs commissioned. They were coming out every year to spend the winters in Palm Springs, and so they really wanted to have their own environment for playing golf, for fishing, for playing tennis, all of that. So they created their own kind of setting for that, and it included acres and acres of lawn, and it was kind of a 9-hole golf course that was played a couple different ways, and it's still there today. The project that we did was work next door at the Center and Gardens, and we started out with Mrs. Annenberg before she passed away, talking about that lawn carrying across the fence through the tamarisk hedge and becoming part of the new landscape. And it took about a year of educating her and kind of moving from what I think everyone thought we were going to do to what we really felt was the right thing to do, which was to abandon the lawn, with the exception of one large area, one 10,000 square foot area in the back where they have special events. So we ended up with a 15-acre site of which we developed the landscape, a Sonoran desert landscape, for about 10 acres, and then we used one site for special events to be lawn. And you know, I guess we've wrestled a lot with it since it's been built, whether or not it should be something else. And I'm like Liz, I think lawn used in a sparing way makes a lot of sense. It's cooling. It's you know, it definitely does some amazing things. It's aesthetically beautiful. If you look at Palm Springs from the air, there's you know, way too much lawn. There's thousands of acres of golf courses. It's kind of a joke the way lawns are used in Palm Springs for the most part, but I think it's kind of a question of scale. At the Annenberg Estate, or at the Center and Gardens, which is again the project that we focused on, having some lawn and having it become that beautiful carpet that's used a lot. Last Saturday there were 250 people in a yoga class on that lawn, and so there's special events that happen all the time. Yesterday I was in a park that we designed over a freeway in Dallas called Clyde Warren Park, and the lawn is totally gone. It's all hard pan. And the park director said, what do we do? You know, and we have this same kind of situation. We flip the beams and we have 9 inches of soil. And it's a real struggle because we've replaced that lawn in 3 years with 1 million visitors a year. We've replaced it 3 times. And so you come to the point of, do you want to keep replacing it? Is there some kind of a hybrid where it's, a lot of the sports fields have this synthetic combination of half synthetic and half lawn, so it gives you the cooling effect, and it's a lot more durable. Or do you just keep replacing the lawn? So it's a bit of a struggle in public places, but I'm a believer that if you treat it instead of wall-to-wall carpets, what we were talking about, if you look at it as kind of an area rug or something beautiful, treat it almost like water, it takes on new meaning.
And Gretchen, from your point of view, how should we see this Southern California lawn? Should we be trying to take it out wherever we can? Should we be taking it out in the domestic landscape and preserving it, as Jim's suggesting, a little bit in the public realm? And when we do, if and when we do take it out, what makes the most sense to replace it with?
There's a lot of questions there, but so first of all, just one thing I noticed with Jennifer Watts's presentation is she had my favorite plant, both at the beginning and at the end, which is an agave. And but an agave, so I used to have a backyard just sort of full of potted agaves, and the kids would play in the driveway, and I would lose a basketball a month to the agave because it would just land. And so there's a downside to having a lawn with just agaves. So you need lawn to play. And I think, although you don't need that much lawn to play, because mostly my kids played in the street, and that seemed to me kind of I'm from the San Fernando Valley, or at least I was when I was raising the kids, and that's kids play in the street. So the lawn is nice when, if they're bleeding at the knee, and you can have a nice place for them. And if they're crawling, lawns are great. So I actually am not a real, I don't want to be too much of
You're not a zealot about
I'm not
taking
as
out
well
lawns.
in some ways, but not in this particular way. But I do think that one of the great things about lawns, even in the San Fernando Valley these days, is it used to be, it was green lawn, green lawn, green lawn, and now it's green lawn, green lawn, whoa, there's something different there. And it's just such a nice change, even just aesthetically. to have all of a sudden, something that you used to see and probably see more in East Los Angeles is there's lawns with crops and fruit trees and exactly what you were saying. So you had much more of an eclectic mix, and you're getting an eclectic mix now. And so I think that the greater the eclecticism, the better it is for the ecology. I mean, pollinators, water use, etc. So I think the big problem is if you have green swards that have to be mowed and fertilized and maintained and watered and have to be uniform, that's when you're in trouble. Yeah.
And also some of the gravelscaping or some of the replacement that people were doing rather quickly to take advantage of the rebates and abatement programs that were going on. That also was done with often plastic sheeting underneath. And can you talk a little bit about the role that it plays in the heat island effect that we heard a little bit about before, and what makes more sense if you are going to go in the direction of doing that kind of replacement?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to step on any toes, but the one sort of blight in my neighborhood and in neighborhoods like mine is the lawn that is brought in by turf terminators, right? So turf terminators, the first step is to, I don't know how exactly they kill it, but then they put down the black plastic. It's sort of permeable, so it's not like a big black plastic bag, but it's black. And then they put gravel, and then they put about 8 plants in a grid that are not really appropriate. They're like daylilies and rosemary and some Mexican sage. And so that's the standard palette. And that, it's hot, right? So, I mean, it's a heat island. So gravel is hot and it's ugly. And just from an ecological point of view, you know that grass takes up carbon dioxide, right? And plants do. Gravel doesn't. So that's a bad thing as far as the turf terminators go. So you lose a lot of good stuff that you had with the grass. You save a lot of water. But there's much better ways to save water. So you can use California native plants, for instance.
And Liz, to what extent is this conversation happening in the wetter parts of the country, in the Northeast?
Well, where there's high density, there's much less of this conversation. It's not. I don't think we're very conscious of this, but we do think about the heat island effect a lot. And we think about green roofs, and all of the buildings that we do are very, very conscious of, how these buildings contribute to the problem or try to transform it. And as I think about, we don't have a good solution. It seems like we like lawns, but we don't like the problem of irrigation of lawns, and some of us don't like even the uniformity necessarily of lawns, but maybe some aspects of it. And I can't help but think that these engineers, these bioengineers that put so much effort into making the better golf course, really, and a lot of effort that's paid for by the golf industry, could be put into a more drought-resistant lawn. And you were talking to him about this type of a half-synthetic lawn, which we're also very familiar with. The way that it changes in various seasons. We were thinking about it actually at Lincoln Center. We have also a patch of lawn that's a green roof, where we were looking at products like that. So, when we think about lawn, it actually, the notion of a product, a lawn product, is a potential idea. So, as we get further and further from the word natural, it's not so hard to imagine that we could have our cake and eat it too somehow.
One of the really crucial questions is as the city gets less suburban, as it kind of tries to identify and establish a kind of post-suburban future, there was something democratic both about the public lawns, but also about the ways in which the lawn was accessible, as I think Colin's video essay suggested, to a broad cross-section. And we did build those, tens of thousands of miniature central parks. And as those disappear, as the city densifies, I think that what we're missing is some way to have a more nuanced conversation about what our public spaces look like or how much water we give to them. Jim, what's your sense about how those things are weighed? You've worked on college campuses, also for cities. How is that conversation being had? How might it be pushed forward in a more productive way in terms of weighing how much in an era of scarce resources, scarce water, how much of it do we devote to, say, the public lawn as opposed to the private one?
Well, a lot of our projects are in urban centers, and they are about densification and mid-rise, high-rise projects, and the whole shared economy strategy of making pocket parks and making smaller places where people can get together and use lawn. There are reasons to have lawn. I don't think that designing parks that have predominant lawn is the kind of new norm. The new norm is to have some lawn even in children's areas, dog areas, areas where lawn kind of makes some sense. But we're starting to, even when we get a commission to design a public park, that percentage of lawn is considerably less than we would have designed 5 years ago, 10 years ago. With just to keep going with that, drought-tolerant plants, native plant species, the appreciation of other ideas for landscape has really grown tremendously. And I'm not talking about gravel on top of plastic, but it's really changed dramatically. And I think people appreciate beautiful plants that are used. Mrs. Annenberg told me, she said, I really don't want to see any sand, and we're in the desert, So it's all blow sand when we started the job, and so you're thinking, okay, how do you make a lush Sonoran desert garden? And we did it, and she loved it. She loved the renderings. Unfortunately, she passed away before we completed the job. But if you go there, you don't see a lot of gravel and sand. I mean, there's some mulch, but it's pretty limiting. So you can design something beautiful without having lawn and without.
And if you were organizing this kind of abatement program, and this is a question for you too, Gretchen, how would you organize it? Does it make sense to have incentives for homeowners to take out their lawns? Should there be stricter, kinds of recommendations about what they replace it with? Does it make sense for cities to be doing that? And if they do it, what should we be putting in place of the lawn? To both, I mean, Jim, that's first for you, and Gretchen too. Go ahead.
Well, so maybe I'll just interject one note here. I think that MWD and the DWP, and again, I don't want to tread on anybody's toes here, but I don't really think that LA did it quite the right way. I think that the rebate program benefited maybe some of the wrong people who didn't need the rebate to begin with.
Including golf course, quite a few golf course owners. The LA Times did a lot of good work on that.
Large property owners. Basically, the greatest turf replacement was to the people who probably needed it least. So really high income areas, which have big lawns. And they are big water users, and so I think we maybe need a better way to target these big water users. And I don't mean shaming and putting their names in the paper yet, but some better way to actually target big users. So I think that a better thing for the MWD and DWP to do is what they did is low flow toilets and efficient washing machines. They really realized a lot more cost effectiveness in those programs than with the lawn rebate turf removal. Yeah.
I was going to say, it's just so interesting how the lawn is like politicized now.
Yeah.
And it used to stand for democracy, right? And now it stands for conspicuous waste. As we speak, I can't help but think that that water isn't the only issue here, right? It's all sorts of resource that it takes to maintain landscape. And with lawns specifically, seeding and mulching and mowing and all of that stuff. But with other kinds of landscapes, there need to be considerable resources spent on keeping up landscape. And so when we start to think about the lawn, especially in cities, We spoke about this a little bit last night, that in New York, there is no city money, there's no municipal money that goes into maintenance of parks. They're all maintained by conservancies, of private donors. And this is something that I think becomes a political issue. I mean, don't we pay taxes? Shouldn't we have access to these spaces that are well maintained? Any kind of landscapes. I think about the High Line. The High Line is a very wild landscape. There are no lawns. Well, there is one little lawn where people make out on it. Very, very kind of special spot. But the rest of it is all wild, but it takes an enormous amount of maintenance to keep it wild and to keep it the right kind of wild. So I mean, I just have that. It's a broader issue than water, I think.
And that raises the question about who will have lawns, let's say just in the private realm, who will have lawns a generation from now in a city like Los Angeles? As I think we can all agree that water is going to get much more expensive, and it's probably a good thing, but it does mean that access to the lawn, putting aside the ecological question, will become a financial one, and there will be landscapes of luxury that have lawns, and it won't play that same role that it's played here. And that raises the question of, those who can afford to water their lawn, should they be able to keep it, at whatever scale they would like to? And I don't think we have clear answers to that. I think also the connection between the growth of the region, and this idea of the growth machine that I mentioned briefly, and the lawn needs to be clarified a little bit. And in fact, growth is what is saving water for Los Angeles. The city of Los Angeles uses less water than it used in the early 1980s, or just about the exact same amount. And that's not per capita, it's total water consumption. And that savings is all the efficiency of the kinds of appliances and changes in residential water that we talked about. But it's really the densification and growth that has really allowed Los Angeles to continue to survive with limited water resources. So I think those things get lost in the equation a little bit. So I think the question for all of you is: you look ahead, you imagine Los Angeles a generation from now. What does it look like? How much lawn are you seeing? And is it something that just gets? I mean, Liz mentioned maintenance. It's a real question for Los Angeles. I think most of the LA Recs and Park would rather have no parks with landscape that they have to maintain lawn or not. But as that kind of access to space moves out of the private realm, what does the rest of the city begin to look like?
Well, I think the lawn will change. Even I think it'll get smaller in a residential private setting. It may go away. I don't see it completely going away, but I do see a more intelligent lawn. The hybrids, some that Liz was showing from '98, have come a long way, and the amount of use of water for some of the new hybrids is 1/5 to 1/7 the amount of water that you would use for a traditional lawn. So that's one thing. The way you deliver water to the lawn in a subsurface way versus spray heads is another way. Even lawns that look like lawns, but they're tufted grasses, carexes, things like that appear to be lawn. They're mowable, but they're for the most part, drought resistant. So I think the kind of different strategies for making lawn are coming on, and I think having something green does something to your, it's a kind of a well-being thing, I think, versus gravel and concrete, things that just sit there and look the same way every day of the year. The lawn does go through some change, and I think it's important to have living, growing things around us.
And what about AstroTurf? There are cities that are beginning to put in AstroTurf in their medians. Pasadena's begun to do that. How is that ecologically? What does that mean? How successful, Gretchen, do you think that strategy is?
I think AstroTurf is a bad idea. I mean, actually, it's hot, and it's not very permeable, although there are varieties that are more permeable now. So if you actually want to capture water, that's a bad way to do it. And it doesn't change. I mean, I think one of the great things would be if we would get into the idea that LA isn't green all year round. Half the year it should be brown, and it can be a beautiful brown. It can be a golden brown. So if we actually accept that, oh, all right, yeah, let's hear it for golden brown. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there.
No, I think getting used to that color is part of this shift. This part of this. I mean, I think the idea of the lawn and that shade that Jim was talking about is so ingrained. It's something we've all, been in a certain way trained to think of as being an appropriate domestic landscape. And part of it is just realizing that brown, the different shades can be just as beautiful. Any defenders of AstroTurf on that end of the panel?
We actually thought about AstroTurf at the Broad and decided it was really kind of crazy because, given the kind of grime in the air, you have to hose it off. You have to wash it off, and it actually consumes water as well. But I was kind of fascinated by your question about like what does LA look like, in the next years. And this is maybe a dystopian vision, a slightly like, the movie Her is just looking slightly into the future, and what does that look like? I imagine this could be very dystopian if there is no grass. It's all hardscape. I mean, wouldn't that be really awful? And another dystopia would be that there are lawns, but you have to pay admission to get in. So it would be, some kind of like, feature that was just so far away from natural in our everyday. So, I mean, I think it's a big issue. I mean, it's something that's hard to part with, and maybe we go through like phases of thinking about this. It reminds me of our anti-meat period. We went through this thing. We all thought that meat was really, was very unhealthy, and we still do that, but we have come back to appreciating, the beauty of the taste of meat. And I kind of feel the same way. Like there's something about this truly American phenomenon of the lawn and British with British antecedents that is so much a part of our culture that it's very, very hard to abandon because it gives so much pleasure to us. And it is just a question of how to make it smart and the issues of better soil and with better water retention, better irrigation, smarter irrigation systems, bioengineered species and so forth. Like, I think science is going to have a lot to do with it.
Yeah, I agree, and this is not, the lawn of the future is not something that's watered with domestic water. It's collected water that you use, and again, I don't see it as being lawn as we know it today, where guys are mowing it and think, the pollution and all the challenges of a lawn are where it's going to go. It's going to change dramatically.
So maybe the shift you're saying is more in the water and how we get it rather than what it's watering, in other words.
Well, the water and how we get it, and what it's watering, yeah. But I would say that the lawn of the future would be the same amount of water that you might use on a vegetable garden. So, you're looking at food production, which I think will be in the landscape of the future, so I see that it's going to change a lot. I'm with you about the artificial turf, Gretchen. I think that will phase out, and I think ultimately it will be banned in some communities. So,
and this shift really gets to, I think, some fundamental questions about how the city sees itself. I mean, that picture I showed of the Sheets Goldstein house, the John Lautner house with that tropical landscape, Karen McWilliams in 1946 described in a book that I'm having my students read, Southern California, an island on the land, sort of at the cusp between first and second LA, describes Los Angeles as an irrigated paradise, and I think it's that double, you need both sides of that equation, that idea that held for so long in the post-war decades that you could make Los Angeles look like any other place, as long as, of course, you had enough water. And that was really the Jim Goldstein vision on that house, is to make it look like a Miami landscape almost, or a South American tropical landscape. And I think that idea that we can create any kind of landscape is going, and it probably should go, but it also means a really significant shift in how we've thought about and read the culture of the city. And I think we've seen architecture as the same way. The kind of wild eclecticism of residential architectural types in the city has been connected to the same set of ideas, that you could import anything here and implant it, whether it's architecture or literal plant, and it would take hold and it would grow. And I think that there's something that's lost as we move away from that. And what's really happening is just that sort of fake covering is being removed, and we're looking, as Jenny was suggesting, at landscapes that look more like what this place looked like before it was urbanized to any degree. And I think that raises a lot of questions about what's left behind and whether we banish. I mean, it's almost as though we're instead of us being banished from the Garden of Eden, we're sort of banishing the garden itself. And I think that leaves a super interesting set of questions about what the city begins to look like.
Does it matter that, and I would assume everybody's going to say it doesn't matter at all because the planet is a very fragile ecosystem, but does it matter that 77% of the water that's used in the state of California goes to agriculture, and 6% goes to residential lawns and landscape and lavender and fresh vegetable gardens and fruiting orchards in your backyard and all that? I mean, it kind of does to me personally, because I'm not for using all of our counts on all of our projects are considerably lower than in Coachella Valley. We were given this much water. We used 20%, and now we've gone down to hardly any water at all for the Annenberg project. So we're kind of a model for using water. But I do think that there's bigger issues with water than the lawn. That's probably for another night. But
no, but it's a good point, because the lawn became a really easy target, a kind of easy villain, because it's what we see. We're thinking about water in the city as we should be. We're thinking about where our water comes from and how much of it we have, and we're looking around. We're not seeing agricultural landscapes, of course, anymore in the city. We're seeing lawns, or we're seeing a kind of urbanized landscape, and so that the agricultural question has been detached. But I think, as Liz said about meat, it's the same thing. That question is beginning to be at least more complicated. But there are all these questions that are tied together. I mean, I think, Gretchen, what you said about thinking about a productive landscape as opposed to, and that's really the shift that's happening in LA, is this idea that we had a whole bunch of separate infrastructures and landscapes that were monocultures. And they were literal monocultures in the sense of lawn sometimes, but they were also more metaphoric monocultures like the freeway or the river, which only did one thing, this kind of single-use infrastructure. And I think the landscape is the same way. So I guess the question is whether you can have a kind of productive landscape that does what a lawn does, but also does more at the same time.
Well, I'm sure you can to a certain extent. I mean, I think that the real value for lawn is that you can make out on it and crawl on. No, seriously. I mean, it's really for walking on and rolling on. And if it's to appeal to your aesthetics, I think we can winnow that down. And in terms of productivity, I think we need to have plants in the city just to do the gas exchange we need, right? We need them, and to keep things cool. So I think I'd say that the greater variety of plants, the better. I mean, it's better for birds and everything else, too. And as for agriculture in the rest of the state, I think we also have to look at that in terms of what was there before. I mean, actually, you showed a picture of what was here before. Actually, was a lot of grass. It wasn't a desert, and it wasn't really chaparral. It was sort of a grassland savanna, which is actually sort of a hominid landscape. It's what we really first came out looking at. So it's a pretty important landscape, and that would be a lot of California, and we need to grow things that would naturally grow in that landscape. One of them is not rice, and I could name some others. But there are some crops that we could and should grow as a state because we've got the weather. So.
I mean, my guess would be that looking into the future, that the domestic landscapes will be less green or less lawn covered, and that the public landscapes, hopefully, ideally, would be much greener. And I think there's some really interesting discussions now about that, wrapping that single-use infrastructure, the freeway, for example, or the river in a new kind of green landscape. And so you see a reversal of how that equation played out in second Los Angeles. And I've been writing a series of pieces on the freeway, and we're going to be publishing some work that architects have done in thinking about how to wrap, and landscape architects, how to wrap the freeway to make it a productive landscape. So it could capture and treat stormwater, it could use landscape to provide shade, and it could have solar arrays to produce energy, it could do all of those things. So I think that that equation could be flipped completely, that the domestic landscape gets less green and the public one gets more planted in a way. I think that's the trajectory that we're heading on. So we've reached 9 o'clock. We got started a little bit late. So please join me in thanking our panelists. And also Jenny Watts and Colin Marshall from afar. And I hope to see many of you out at the Hammer next month for a conversation about streets and public space with Jeanette Sadik Khan. Thank you so much for coming.